Good evening, and welcome to Mirador Television's Round Table. I had a very jolly afternoon sitting outside in the sun outside a pub, sipping away and seeing very happy faces, except that the conversation was very gloomy. Is there another spike on the way, and have the politicians been far too optimistic in stopping lockdown? Well, I think it's a problem on both sides of the Atlantic. So first of all, let's go to Melissa in New York.
Well, I think we're still stuck in the first phase of the virus. New York's numbers are down, far down, after being the highest in the country. And so now we're looking at states like Florida and Texas and California and now the Midwest. So we're still involved in it. They opened up very quickly, probably thinking it was a New York virus, but it's clearly not.
Stephen, you have been around the town today, our little town on the almost on the south coast of England, and it was very merry and bright. What's your view?
Well, it was merry and bright outside one or two restaurants who've got more seating on the pavement than they should have, but other shops and other places are very quiet. There aren't the people about, and I went on an expedition to New Haven to collect some dry cleaning, and New Haven wasn't sure if it had woken up yet either. People, I think, are still very worried. Numbers on the local bus routes are very low. People are not traveling by bus.
Now, you look carefully at information from abroad and the statistics. Are you worried that there is a second wave, or as Melissa says, the first wave hasn't ended?
Oh, in my own opinion, the first wave hasn't ended, and the messages given out by our politicians have been so mixed and confusing that one almost thinks they're doing it deliberately to kill off a few more people to be able to raid their pension pots.
Well, let's talk about the pensions, because, Paul, one of the things, obviously, that is driving politicians to act maybe precipitously is the state of the economy. They've spent billions. Every country has spent billions at the moment without revenue coming in, and the revenue is likely to dip if we get another hit or if this one lasts any longer. What's the economic situation?
Well, Keith, before this began, I wrote an article, if you remember, for us, and it was Health for the Economy, where, you know, I think one of my quotes was, a person who's dead can't really take much part in the economy, so which is more important? One thing I'd like to say is that politicians are making terrible mistakes. it sounds awful, I'm defending the politicians to this extent. We're all in the unknown. We all don't have the answers. So to just throw at the politicians isn't right, but I would say politicians have to be pragmatic. Boris, as from my knowledge, has clearly said that there's a slight risk that I've got to move from health situations to the economy. You could argue, this is a kind of semantic thing, you could argue, if I go for health completely, economy, well, that's awful. If I go for economy totally, to get the balance, it's almost impossible. I don't actually believe I think there'll be a second wave. It'll be mooted from what I've done of my medical research. So the point is, on the pension side, yes, everyone's going to be worried, but if you look at the market, it's not gone down as much as I'd expected it to. And I must say this, if there's not a second wave or a spike, then what will happen is by Christmas, the fund managers are saying, look, there will be a recovery on the pension funds. If we take quarters, as economists do, by the first or second quarter end, the economy would have gone back to a shape that we would realise. So I'm tracking that ahead. There's so many different angles, but that's my view of it. The politicians may well have made mistakes, but hey, imagine if we were in their seats. I wouldn't know exactly what to do.
Oh, if it's not the politicians, it's the civil service. But walking through Lewis this afternoon, it's amazing the number of shops and restaurants that are now closing down or not reopening. So if in fact the markets are getting some encouragement from somewhere, where are they getting encouragement from?
Okay, I'll tell you this, when I had to give a lecture at University of Westminster, I said, I've been in finance about 36 years and traveling to America, etc. There are two words in the English language that have to be really decided: market confidence. I've worked in markets which are going mad, yet the confidence is there because somehow people turn it round. There's the market confidence of fund managers. At the moment, the fund managers are not being what I'd call suicidal or jumping off a New York building. So my view is, this is where I think we'd all agree, is if there is a second wave, what will happen is that what I've just said about the 4 months of Christmas, then the next 2 quarters, fine. If there's a second wave, the market confidence goes, and we're all in a very difficult situation. I haven't got the answer to that, but I've got this short-term view that it might be better than most people think. But it won't be over. But a second wave would really damage the economy, maybe irreparably. I don't know.
Well, let's go back to New York with somebody who always sees the glass tipping over. Suzanne, what's your view of the situation?
Well, one of the questions that we had when we opened this up was whether or not we closed prematurely. And I actually think that one of the problems that we had in the United States is that only a few states actually really closed. And it appears that that's kind of the secret to success with this particular disease, is that unless you completely close and then once you reopen, do it slowly, retain the mask, retain the distance, that you're not going to have success. And so we have some states that kind of did a soft close and then reopened, and then unfortunately are having these second spikes. Like I was just reading about Louisiana, where it's really quite tragic there, where there's just isn't good direction, and there's just really recommendations, and then there's all this suspicion about the recommendations. And I would say that I understand that government and politics have to basically sort of determine a tract that appeals to both science and also practicality. But human life has to be at the forefront of all of those decisions, and taking the advice of other countries that are successful at it just seems to be the best plan. And I don't think we're doing that, you know. So.
Of the 50 states, are the preponderance those who have acted wisely or foolishly?
I think the majority have not been following sound advice that's successful in other countries. Like for instance, New York has a travel ban policy. So if other countries, if people are coming from other states, they have to quarantine to 14 days when they're in New York. And that list started with 4 states. It's now up to 34 states. I mean, we only have 50. So it's a real, and it just, the list keeps on growing. So there are just other states that are having these markers that are pretty significant about the amount of virus that's in these states. And unfortunately, until we just, I think that we probably will have to do another hard close, but that's just, you know, from what I can see.
Mark, some of the messages that are coming out of our own government in Westminster have been somewhat mixed and somewhat confusing, at least if we trust in what the media say. But where do we stand? Have the politicians acted precipitously, or are they still on track for what they believe? And is your view, because you are a politician, is your view that they're not doing too badly?
I think it's a very difficult situation to try and gauge the timing of these things. I have a lot of respect for anybody who's been given the task of trying to work that out. It's very easy to sit back and comment from the armchair. It's another thing trying to weigh up all the factors to decide when something is going to be locked down, when it's going to be eased up. I think the biggest problem we face is the fact that the world is a very big place. Particularly Britain is quite a well-connected place. So as we start to ease up on the lockdown, we have people coming in from other areas that are just starting to get their infection rates going up. So it's a permeability across the world that we're seeing that I think is part of the effect. And I would say also you have the same effect in the States across the whole of the states. Each of the states has its own character. Unless you lock everybody down at exactly the same time and relying on the fact that the virus is traveling or taking hold at the same pace in every single country, eventually you're going to be ending up with some sort of lag. The early movers are going to, once they start coming out of lockdown, are going to start to have to face the influx of people coming in from areas that have only just started to receive coronavirus cases. You can't have it all at lockdown at the same time.
Melissa, does the central government, or could the central government have grabbed the states by the throat and sort of said, you are all going to listen to us and you're all going to do what we say? Do they have that power?
Well, it's not that they would have the power, but certainly the power of persuasion just wasn't used. There were a lot of mixed messages coming out of our central government, so to speak. You know, liberate the states, let them open, let the economy start again, when clearly we were in trouble. And there's almost a feeling with our central government that if we ignore it long enough, it'll go away and everything will be fine by election day in November. So that's clearly not the case. So perhaps it would be best, our president is now considering moving the election because I guess his poll numbers are down. And anyway, that's my opinion.
Stephen, when she said moving the election, I thought your hand would go up.
Well, not necessarily about that, although I will add, I thought that the president's term finished when it does anyway, whether he has an election or not. His period in office has a finite date for finishing. So moving the election is neither here nor there. Someone else will have to do it when his time is up. But I wanted to come back, Keith, if I may, on what you said about Lewis shops not reopening. There is a list of 24. But you have to remember two things about this ancient county town. One is that when it had its own borough council prior to 1974, that borough council had the plan of moving all the shopping to the bottom of the high street, where the precinct is, and that the top of the high street would become mainly professional offices. Then you have the more recent thing with things going online, and this has merely hastened what would have been a decline in a local high street anyway. This would have happened. The fact that it's happening now, well, it's a shame, but a lot of businesses were already planning on not staying open. Laura Ashley in the town you can do nothing about because the firm's in administration and the property is vacant. There are others, we notice, which will not reopen. But so what? If the retail margin, if the retail business is now all online, what hope is there for a high street anyway? What Lewis needs, though it will probably deny it, is a niche shopping centre where people can come who have perhaps more money than sense and will buy things they don't really need just to show what good taste they've got. And barristers' offices are closing because there is no need for that suite of offices now. You need a general room for the clerks, but DX, the document exchange, has all but finished. Things are happening by email. This pandemic has hastened, in my mind, or not only in my mind, in my voice, has hastened my thoughts of what were going to happen anyway. This was inevitable. It's just quicker than we were expecting. But then,
well, you know my feeling about computers, and anybody that doesn't, I can go for hours on them. But Paul, I'm going to dump this in your lap now because everybody has said we're not absolutely sure what's going to happen, and that is quite proper at this very point in time. But I'm thrusting a crystal ball under your nose right now. What is the likelihood of the next 6 months, 12 months in terms of human race?
Okay, when I was at uni, I studied the German economy at the end of the Second World War. If you were living in Germany for the last few months, you would look at your country and say, there is no way we'll ever come back at all. Now, I'm not using that extreme example, but what I see, not in our current esteemed panel, But I see a lot of people taking the pessimistic view. I'm not pessimistic whatsoever. If you look through all of history, especially the 20th century, you'll find that always we will either change to different fashions, different buildings, different. I quite remember when they were talking about the city of London and spending so much money on it, oh, it can't be done, etc. You look at what's happened there. So my view is, okay, the guy who I personally like to have a balance of being online for 2 days and going into an office for 3 days. I believe that's what I like to do. We differ. But as all of you have said, the world doesn't stop. You know, Germany didn't look at themselves at the end of the war and think, oh my God, they just got on with it. And have a guess what? They're now the strongest economy in Europe. So I don't worry so much because I've seen so much in my life and so many changes in the city, in New York, that actually the human being is very resourceful and will always find another thing to replace what he thought was of great value.
Okay, Mark, let me come back to you because what Paul has just said is a large measure of truth. But the Second World War, many would argue, started because of a worldwide recession. What's your view on that?
You start getting into sort of quite difficult territory there because it depends whose interest it was to start the war. In that case, are you saying all players had an interest? Look at all the people that actually did quite well out of it. It wasn't just started by those that had aspirations. You know, so some of the nations that were on the winning side did very well out of it. So maybe I don't particularly want to drift into that into that analysis.
Well, I don't want it to get too deep.
But I will say,
I mean, the question tonight is have the politicians acted precipitously? And I think that probably, if we've come to the conclusion that possibly they have, or it's been uncoordinated, I suppose that it's incumbent upon us to say, what the hell's going to happen then?
I think I'm along with Paul. Actually, I'm optimistic. I think that human beings are quite resilient. We go through difficulties. We change the system, and we bounce back, and we change. We thrive after that. I think if you look at the Black Death when it swept across Europe, it left behind a massive social change in Northern Europe because there were fewer people tied to the land. It changed the feudal system so that people were given greater freedom and rights. Certainly in Northern Europe. I think in Southern Europe it had the opposite effect because it didn't really affect them in quite the same way. So the landowners held onto their land more tightly and became even more despotic. So I'm led to believe.
Now, does that give you any hope, Suzanne?
Mark's statement, of course, anything Mark says gives me hope. Always just, you know, such a bright comedic light in the world. But I'll also say, you know, to what Paul was saying, New York is an example of a city that really does seem to rise above things. I lived here during September 11th, and, you know, there was a moment there where I don't think we thought that we would ever come back to much of anything because it was just so extraordinarily difficult. But we did, and it became one of the best economies once again. And I feel like New York is already undergoing another transformation. Our movement of Black Lives Matter right now in the United States is important for so many reasons, should have also happened a long time ago. So the fact that there was this moment where everyone was so tense, I think we were just willing to accept more tension and it may be hopefully trying to figure some more things out in our society. And another great thing that's happening in New York right now, although it frightens me a little bit, but it's a good thing, is all of our restaurants have flooded out onto the sidewalks and to the streets. This is something we should have done years ago, but it was just so difficult to even become a sidewalk restaurant. Now you don't need any approvals. You just go out and you open up a shop and you start serving your neighbors. And so there's great things that come out of this, and I feel it's going to continue. It doesn't mean that anything that politicians do don't matter. It does matter. And we do have to have politicians and government officials that really, really have the best interest of everyone at heart. And I think that, you know, elections have consequences. So hopefully people will realize that again.
Don't get locked into a room with Stephen when you're talking about sidewalk cafes. He's not at all happy with that.
Yeah,
Well, no, sidewalk cafes. Keith, sidewalk cafes are fine if you've got enough sidewalk to have them on.
Yeah.
But in Lewis, as you know, there's hardly any sidewalk, and so people walking in the road to be mown down by advancing cyclists who want a contraflow lane.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful.
Now we're into an argument we've had in Lewis today, but we won't,
Oh,
we won't
no.
go into that right now. But let's have a final word, because what I really was asking, or the point of the thing tonight, was have our politicians acted too quickly? Are we relaxing too fast? Lisa?
Well, I think part of the country, yes. But I think we as citizens, it's difficult for a politician to anticipate this. This is very difficult. So, but I think that we as citizens have become informed as to what's best, you know, social distancing and wearing a mask. So I think we all have to start thinking for ourselves and not just simply rely on the politicians.
Stephen?
I would certainly agree with Melissa. I agree with Mark and Paul as well. Life will start again, but it will not be what life we had at the beginning of this year. Things will be seen in different perspectives. And that's good, man adapts. But so don't expect things to be as they were. Things will be different, and not necessarily better, but they will be different and they will continue. But I think the messages given out by our politicians have been mixed. They have not been focused, and you can see that by shots of Brighton Beach and Bournemouth Beach in the past couple of days. You see it when an awful lot of younger people do not have masks on trains or on buses. They don't see it as a young person's disease, and this is where we may get some consequences in the future.
Paul?
Is it a decision too quickly? If you read my article, Keith, I think there's no one that's going to get it right. I think, talking on the Boris side, made a few mistakes, but overall, you think one day you're just elected, etc. You've got the affairs of state, and suddenly you've got this weird disease which no one knows about. Now, I know they're supposed to be smarter than us, etc. But I think we sometimes invest our politicians with, what's the old saying in Britain? We trace our heroes to shoot them down. So yes, Boris may well have got it wrong, but only time will tell. And what would you, I, Melissa, Mark, etc. do if they were in their shoes? I think most governments, perhaps with the exception of a couple of Mediterranean countries, didn't react quick enough. And I still come back to the basic point that I thought that borders should be closed, but that's for another disease. But yeah, I'm totally agree with you that we will go from strength to strength. In a year or two's what I call moratorium, what the hell's happening? But the economy, as Stephen said, will change and adapt to whatever circumstance comes up. That's why we're such a clever race, or should be.
Paul? Mark?
Okay. I think that opening up was probably a reasonable, certainly in the UK, was probably a reasonable decision based on the idea that you look, you test it out, things were looking like they were going in the right direction. You give people a certain amount of responsibility, as Melissa said, to look after themselves, to see whether we can, and you have to act remarkably quickly.
Suzanne, I hope that the meadows that we're going to walk hand in hand aren't going to disappear. You have the final word.
I think I'm going to wrap it up for all of us. I'm going to say that regardless of the decisions that are made by our government or even by science for that matter, we do have personal responsibility, as we all agree. And we really do just have to be taking in the information and process it properly and look out for one another. And as long as we do that, I think that we're going to once again prevail and hopefully have an even better world afterwards.
Well, we've taken our allotted time. Thank you to the panel. All I would say is that I remember when the EU changed us from gallons to kiloliters or whatever that funny sort of measure is, but they allowed us to still drink beer in a pint. Yeah. And as long as that doesn't change, I will be a happy man. Thank you to the panel. Good night.
Night.
Right.